Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Issue on the ASGCT podcast network. I'm your host, Emily Walsh Martin. Today on The Issue, we have a very special guest, Arizona State University Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics professor, Dr. Ben Hurlbut. After hearing Ben's insightful questions at the ethics session at the 2024 annual meeting and seeing him at past policy summits, I knew we would have to have him on the podcast. This is a critical conversation for our industry where we try to unpack how ethics informs and impacts the work we do in gene and cell therapy, and offers a deep dive into one of the topics in this space, the ethical, medical, and social considerations around germline gene editing. This is a not to be missed episode that I know you will enjoy. But first, guys, just register. The Policy Summit is next week, and it is the place to be September 23rd and 24th, either in person or online. I promise you it will be some of the most thought-provoking content you will hear all year. And now, on to the podcast. All right. Welcome to the show, Dr. Ben Hurlbut. I'm so happy to have you here. We've had a couple of conversations in anticipation of this podcast, and there's just so much to cover. And I'm really, really excited to have you as a guest on the podcast today. Why don't we start at the top? Tell us a little bit about your career path.
Well, first, let me say thanks very much for having me here. It's really a pleasure to be here. So my career path. So my background is in history and sociology of science, or a field called science and technology studies that tries to understand the social, institutional, cultural, political, and ethical dimensions of science and technology in social context, if you will. And my interest going into that field, and really even before it, is that intersection where technically complex issues that are sort of the domain of experts bump up against questions of right and wrong, ethical questions, that in a sense in a democracy belong to all of us. So how do we work at that interface, and how do we understand and address problems at that interface through what ways of thinking, through what processes, through what institutions, through what kinds of routines? Because of course, ethical issues are everywhere in the biosciences and biomedicine and biomedical research, which is sort of where my focus is. And yet work has to be done. They have to be addressed. We have to figure them out and move forward. There have to be routines laid down and so forth. So in my research, I have looked at essentially the development of ethics, not only as a domain of thought, but as a domain of thought, not only as a kind of professional domain. There didn't used to be a field called bioethics. Now there is. There are masters and PhDs and academic positions and positions within companies and so on and so forth. But also the kind of institutional practices, even the administrative practices that have come to be bioethics. So where a set of rules or a set of principles get laid down in a certain moment, those turn into routines. They become paperwork. They become steps in a process, and you ask very specific questions within the steps in those process, but you may not ask why you ask those questions, and could you ask other questions, and are there other questions that should be asked? Are these steps sufficient? So it's ethics as compliance as opposed to ethics as open-ended reflection. And in my work, I, in a sense, participate in these ethical discussions, but also try to step back from them and understand why we have the kind that we have, why we don't have, other kinds that we could have, and kind of with what consequences. How does this give shape not only to forms of ethical judgment, but also to forms of scientific practice, and to what you might think of in broader terms as approaches to democratic governance, because science and technology are, important expressions of a society's sense of what is desirable and good, and they are standard bearers of progress in a certain sense. And yet, to what degree are they democratically accountable? To what degree are they informed by broader conceptions of the good? To what degree is the sort of rest of society that stands on the sidelines of these esoteric domains of science and technology limited to kind of reacting to what happens as opposed to informing judgments about what's worth doing and what isn't? Those are the sorts of questions that I want to understand, both as as actual matters, as a sort of sociologist, as actual matters of practice, but also as a sort of ethicist, thinking about, well, how well are we doing this, and can we do better?
Right. And, I'm going to rewind a little bit to something you said, early. You mentioned that at some point, right, ethics becomes routine. And for me, the one example of that ethics is compliance, I think is the terminology used as well. For me, that harkens back to when I was taking training for good clinical practices, GCPs, about how to run a clinical trial, what the expectations are, and they're all embedded in, frankly, a history of examples where things went wrong, right, or where we decided with reflection that we should and must have better standards for how we conduct clinical trials. And then to your point, like they get memorialized into a set of, guidelines or guidances and practices that we then, execute through compliance, right? That we sort of go through as a routine. And it seems to me that, and maybe this is why you find yourself where you do in terms of your areas of interest, like the areas of gene and cell therapy force us to think about whether those routines are sufficient. The GCPs of the past for small molecule drugs, are those still, if you will, sufficient for the kinds of therapies that gene and cell therapies represent? Is that sort of catching what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think gene and cell therapy is a fantastically interesting area, not just because of the extraordinary scientific work that's being done and technologies being developed, but also because it's a different kind of biomedical paradigm, actually. And it's a different research paradigm. I mean, the right of withdrawal was a sort of fundamental element of clinical research, of human subjects research from the beginning. I mean, what does that mean when it's like there's a before and after, but you can't stop a one and done sort of treatment, even when it's experimental. So yes,
Yeah.
that's absolutely right. And, it's also the case that those approaches were designed to solve, I mean, they were responses to failures, absolutely, but they imagined universals. As long as we do these things every time, everything will be covered in response to particular kinds of failures. And of course, you can't imagine all the other possible ways in which things might go wrong. But if you have your kind of universalist solution attached to a very specific kind of failure, then it maybe actually isn't addressing the other sorts of things. So just another example of what's changed since the 1970s, late 1970s, when these sort of principles got laid down, is research has become highly international, right? The
Mm.
offshoring of form, and this is for good old fashioned small molecule drugs, right? I mean, it's just one example of, if there are different sort of social, cultural, economic, political circumstances in play that are not that were maybe kind of presumptively baked in some respects to the original ideas of what one would need to comply with, or are we addressing those things sufficiently? To some degree, we try to address them with little add-ons to a otherwise fairly standardized structure of compliance, but is that good enough? And I think that for gene and cell therapies, especially kind of one-time therapies, especially given to children, say, or I mean, they're complicated in ways that it's worth thinking about revisiting some of the underlying assumptions that are guiding compliance, just simply to be able to ask ourselves, are the things we're taking for granted things that we should take for granted? Are there questions that we're not asking that we should ask? My sense is actually a lot of people in the field do feel somewhat uncomfortable about things that they don't have to contend with directly because they're just not part of the sort of compliance recipe, but maybe they should be.
Right. Absolutely. For me, this part of our conversation is taking me back to basically the first informed consent that I had to help author as a program lead back in the day. And you're right, like the right of withdrawal, like that's a standard part of the boilerplate, right? That you're supposed to write something about your ability to withdraw from the trial. And yet there's I think we use language like there's no withdrawing from the therapy once it's administered, but you can withdraw from, the processes of the trial, the continued surveillance and that sort of thing. But we kind of hope you don't, because, these therapies need to be studied for long periods of time. And so you're right. It, already just because of the nature of these therapies, it's having to evolve. And to your point, are these things that we can evolve as sort of bolt-ons to the things we already consider, or do they require a new way of thinking, I guess? Can you share a little bit about your involvement with ASGCT as well? Because I know you've been very involved, and I think I think it's really good to hear of what you do with ASGCT as an organization.
Yeah, so I've been sort of peripherally paid attention to ASGCT for a long time, but I guess my involvement began when ASGCT got involved itself a little bit with discussions around heritable genome editing or germline genome editing back in the it's now almost a decade ago, I guess. And I spoke at the ASGCT Policy Summit in some pre-pandemic year that I can't remember, I think 2019, and then joined the ethics committee, and then was chair of the ethics committee for a while, and have just cycled off of that chair position. And it's been a really exciting time to be coming to the meetings and engaged with people in the field, because as you and I suppose everyone listening to this knows, the field is sort of exploding, growing extremely rapidly and into all sorts of interesting and new domains. The meeting itself is growing, exponentially, it seems
Right.
like, at least. And so it's afforded all these interesting opportunities for engagement with people working in the field, especially people working in industry who, in a funny way, there's less engagement with people working in industry in kind of academic conversations around, or conversations whose agendas are set by people working in academic environments around the ethical dimensions.
Yeah. Well, and you've already started to open up the conversation into the range of topics we hope to talk about, with your comment about heritable gene therapies, heritable gene editing. But I think it's important to reflect, which we've already kind of started to do, that ethical considerations kind of touch almost everything of what goes on when we're developing novel gene and cell therapies. It goes from, selection of the indication, the disease you're trying to treat, the level of therapeutic mechanistic validation of the edit or the therapy that you're trying to create, that you have before you start a clinical study, your assessment of off-target or unintended risks from the therapy prior to starting a clinical trial, dose selection, frankly, that for me has always been a big, important part of the early phase of gene and cell therapy development, because the goal is to give every participant in a trial some expectation of possible benefit, right? Because of the risks that they are undertaking as a volunteer, and trying to pick doses of the therapy that ensure some level of appropriate risk benefit for every single trial participant, not just the participant who happened to be at the third dose level. Informed consent, placebo controls, long-term follow-up, balancing expanded access against doing continued clinical trials for post-approval access, and also notably access to ancillary supports like fertility preservation for some therapies, where that will be impacted just by going through that therapeutic process. So there's a lot we can talk about, but I think I want to take us back to where you started our conversation, which was the concept of germline therapies and somatic therapy. So two, in theory, different applications of the technologies that people are developing. One involves, just editing or treating a person's cells who has a disease, and another is, treating an embryo or zygote such that you're preventing a disease from occurring for an individual. And, I think, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but my guess is there's going to be some considerations from an ethical point of view that apply to both. And then some areas where there's particularities. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, definitely. Although one thing that's worth noting is that, I mean, in a sense, this is a quite old discussion that goes back. I mean, it pre-existed the technologies that would have allowed the interventions, but that goes back even as far as the 1960s. You might even say 1950s. And it's worth noting that originally one of the key, maybe the key distinction was a distinction between therapy and enhancement. Which is it's actually a difficult line to pin down, right? And it's not even clear that thinking about it in terms of a line is the right way to think about it, because you don't have to be a very sophisticated historian of medicine to know that conceptions of disease and disorder can change pretty quickly over relatively short periods of history. Things that were once diseases are now just human variation, and actually the other way around as well. So that distinction sort of gave way in thinking to a germline somatic distinction, where it was sort of like the complicated questions got pushed onto the germline side and the somatic side was more straightforward. It does seem to me that for the moment that is kind of where we are, because the kinds of somatic therapies that are being developed for really serious diseases, and they're especially, in some cases for diseases for which there was simply no therapeutic option. I mean, there was nothing or very little. And now there are interventions that people hesitate to use the cure word, and I think that's probably good, but they're not far from it, or they look like they're not far from it. And so that's quite extraordinary. But, there's no doubt a moment in the future where it's going to be necessary to think a little bit more carefully about that therapy enhancement distinction as larger interventions for larger markets, or maybe less serious conditions that are in the sort of ambiguous zone, cosmetic considerations, for example, or whatever, where, these are going to be where that distinction will come back into play. That distinction, of course, is very much in play in the germline domain, because you said germline therapy. I guess I would insist that we put a big question mark next to the word therapy when you're talking germline, because, and here I'll make a kind of argument. There is something very important about this distinction. Intervening in the germline, even if it's in order to address the future manifestation, even the inevitable manifestation of disease, should not be thought of therapy in the way we generally think of therapy, because therapy in medicine, since time immemorial, is treatment of a patient who presents with disease, with illness and infirmity.
Something is broken. Yeah, let's fix the thing that's broken.
It's not just that something is broken. There is a person.
Yes, there's a person.
There is a patient. There is a patient affected by a broken gene, whatever. Yeah. Whereas a germline intervention, in effect, creates the patient as it, quote unquote, treats the disease. Yeah. Right? So either you modify the gametes or you modify the embryo at the moment of the inception of the embryo. And of course, the planning of the modification has to pre-exist the embryo. I mean, you're not discovering that the embryo is affected and then modifying it. You're modifying the embryo in the moment that you're creating it, in effect. And that's an important distinction. So in other words, in the Nuffield Council, the UK Bioethics Council has put this, I think, quite clearly and articulately. Germline genome editing or heritable genome editing should be thought about as a reproductive technology, a technology that's fulfilling a reproductive desire, as opposed to a therapeutic technology, a technology that is treating disease in a patient. However, if you think about disease the way we tend to think about it, which is like people have a disease, but we design technologies to treat a disease. And it's kind of like which people the disease is in is secondary to the development of the technology, if you see what I mean. It's like, and this is just, this is how we've thought about disease for 100 years. I mean, there's this transition in the history of medicine where you stop thinking about a person with some constellation of factors that is manifesting as disease and disorder in that particular body. And you need to know the weather, and you need to know the age, you need to know the diet, and the et cetera, to thinking about having a different kind of nosology, specific diseases that are the focus of specific treatments. So you have a disease and there's a drug for that disease, and it kind of doesn't matter
Right.
which body that disease is in, you treat the disease.
Right.
And there's a sense in which, in this domain especially, I mean, genetic disease lends itself to this kind of conceptual model, but it becomes easy to think of the project as addressing the disease as opposed to addressing the condition of a person being affected in their existing body by that disease. And so, for some, you can see how the heritable genome editing, somatic genome, I mean, they become somewhat interchangeable if you're just simply asking the question, what's the most effective way to interrupt this disease, to prevent the manifestation of this disease. And, for the moment, for a variety of reasons, there is, virtually no focus on heritable genome editing, an enormous focus on developing somatic therapies. But there is no reason why we should believe that that is going to continue to be the case, particularly given that there are a whole set of factors, institutional, economic, et cetera, which may push things in a germline direction, and there's an appetite for it. I mean, one of the other meetings I try to go to is the American Society for Reproductive Medicine. And, I was at that meeting a few years ago. It was sort of looking retrospectively at 40 years of American IVF and looking forward to the next 40 years. And a significant amount of the meeting was about, the future transformation of reproduction, which includes, integration of genetic engineering into reproductive practices. And I mean, if you're in the business of providing IVF, your market is limited to the people who are infertile or whatever. But if your market expands to all the people who have anxieties about passing on bad genes to their children, well, it's an enormous market, especially, by the way, if what you're selling to people is a preventative promise where the clinical trial, the efficacy of the intervention really actually won't be empirically knowable for the 50 or 60 or 70 years it takes for the Alzheimer's you've ostensibly prevented to manifest or not manifest. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And so there is a sense in which the bar of demonstration is at least potentially a lot lower, even as there is a category of people who are quite anxious, like who doesn't want their child to have the best shot at good life and is prepared to pay extra for it. I mean, that describes many, many parents, right? And you're much more likely to have people who are prepared to do this proactively in the context of reproduction than people who would, even undertake a somatic gene therapy for preventative purposes when they are not facing disease and they may not have a particularly high risk of facing disease.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so much to unpack with what you just said. The things that really resonated with me were, first, just the concept of therapeutic versus enhancement. Let's start there, because what's interesting to me about that is that even in somatic, we're going to face that question, and I think for a lot of reasons, and probably all good reasons. The initial focus of the field has really been on that therapeutic bend, and rather than the enhancement bend. And in part, that's been because I like to think we acknowledge that there are a bunch of unknowns about these therapies, these technologies that we're using, and we want there to be the right risk benefit. And so if we have a demonstrable deficit that we're trying to correct or fix, we have a patient in front of us, they have an illness. We, to your point, we understand if it's a Mendelian disease, we understand the mechanism of that illness. The gene is broken. They are presenting with, and they're suffering because of that gene being broken. Let us try to put the gene back and fix it. And to your point, it's an interesting concept to conceive of germline gene editing or gene therapies more as reproductive approaches rather than treatment approaches, because a patient doesn't exist, is what you were saying. At the point where you're applying the technology, there is no patient. There's a possibility of a future patient because of the cluster of genetics that might exist in that embryo or gamete or what have you, but the patient doesn't yet exist. I mean, did I summarize that correctly? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I would even say it's not just that it's in that embryo. The embryo itself doesn't exist, generally speaking,
Right.
because you're teeing up the gametes for fertilization,
Right.
even as you're teeing up the gene editing intervention. Yes.
Right. So I think we can't discuss this sort of topic of germline editing and the complexities therein without discussing some of the recent history, right? With He Jiankui's startling revelation in November of 2018 that he'd actually gene edited two twin embryos and implanted them, and they were carried to term. And so I guess I'd love to understand sort of your sense of that event and the impact it had, certainly on the field of ethics, but how do you think it also impacted our field of gene and cell therapy, or should it impact if it hasn't yet fully impacted us enough?
Yeah, I think this is a really important case to examine carefully and learn from, not so much because of the project of one particular experiment undertaken by one particular scientist, but to understand the broader context that unfolded from. And actually, let's tell a little story that connects with the things that we were discussing earlier that I think is illustrative of this. So I was at the Hong Kong summit. So just for people who don't know quite the timeline of this. So what happened was there was a series of summits organized by the U.S. National Academies, U.S. National Academies, the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Actually, the Hong Kong one was the Hong Kong Academy of Sciences for various reasons, and the British Royal Society. There had been a summit in 2015. This was the second one, 2018, and then there was another one, which was 2023, I think, last year. The purpose of these was to have a kind of international dialogue around the ethical implications of emerging technologies of genome editing. And He Jiankui was slated to speak at this one amongst lots of other people, including me. But then the day before the summit, a reporter, Antonio Regalado of MIT Technology Review, published an article basically revealing this was based on some sort of clinical trial, interim clinical trial data that He had posted, basically revealing that there were at least pregnancies underway, and then an Associated Press reporter who had been embedded with the team published a follow-up piece. Indeed, there had been births, there were children. The whole thing kind of came out into the open in the roughly 24 hours before the beginning of this summit, where essentially everybody engaged with these issues was gathered together in one place. So it really made it into a kind of crazy show.
And some of us were sitting at our kitchen table in Boston watching, because it was video telecast
right.
at
So you
2
had to be
a.m. or in the morning.
up very late for that. Yes, right, exactly.
Yeah.
So on the second day of the 3-day summit, they carved out a space for He to present his work and answer questions. And, I mean, he was, in a sense, rightly attacked, challenged vigorously by both the moderators of the discussion and members of the audience. But one of the things that was really striking to me sitting in the audience during the Q&A was that there was this overwhelming sense of anger and disgust at what he had done. And I mean, the questions reflected that. But the questions very quickly became questions about how he must have violated the ethical procedures associated with human subjects research because this was a bad experiment. It was like, this was an unethical experiment. Let us discover how this experiment is unethical by looking at whether you complied with the sorts of things you're supposed to comply with in order to make an experiment ethical. So people ask questions like, these people must have been low education to participate in this. In other words, your informed consent wasn't really informed. I mean, a lot of these questions end up focusing on sort of informed consent and whether the informed consent was genuinely informed and genuinely consensual, right? Which I think is remarkable. It's a interesting illustration of how we actually kind of have an impoverished vocabulary for talking about these things together. Because is informed consent, I mean, suppose the informed consent was just absolutely exceptionally very well done, and I would argue that it wasn't actually all that badly done. Would that make it an ethical experiment, ethically accepted? No, I think probably people would still feel that sense of anger and disgust, right?
Right.
So it points to the fact that the kind of shared priors, the shared vocabulary, the shared commitments that we reach to in order to ask questions about whether this is good, whether it's ethically acceptable or not, maybe need some attention. Like maybe they need some expansion, there should be collective engagement with those things, because did you get your paperwork right is really not a very compelling way to interrogate something like that. And one of the other reasons that the kind of corollary to this observation about the sort of impoverishment of the ethical repertoire is just how much of the judgment about what is good and desirable actually gets done by the people who are in the business of innovation, who don't see themselves as doing ethics because there are committees to do ethics, but see themselves as doing progress, you might say. But of course, judgments about what's good for people, I mean, judgments about what counts as progress, what sort of forms of technical capacity are worth aspiring to, those are ethical judgments. And I think what you see in the He case, and I can give more details about this, but let me just paint sort of broad strokes, is that the discussion that unfolded with the advent of CRISPR sort of in the 2014, 2015, really gets started in 2015 and following years, that sort of discussion, which really emerged most strongly within sort of the scientific members of the scientific community who are engaged in this research with some involvement from bioethicists and so forth, was trying to navigate the question of whether and under what circumstances research in this domain should proceed. And I mean, let me just make an assertion. Science is one of the great achievements of kind of Enlightenment civilization. It is a social institution that reflects some of our best projects and commitments, but it is itself embedded within and thus should be responsive to society's conceptions of what is right and good. I mean, we were all fascinated by watching Oppenheimer, in part, I would argue, because of that strange tension there, where it was like, actually, maybe that wasn't calibrated to a kind of collective judgment about what sort of technological futures are desirable. Actually, maybe it was walking us not into a dream but a nightmare or whatever. And there's a sense in which this conversation, well, it's quite different than what happened around the bomb, is not altogether different in the sense that it's too easy to equate good science in the sense of research that is undertaken for the advancement of knowledge in ways that are stand up to peer review scrutiny and so on and so forth, to equate that kind of good science with science that's good for society. And I would say that those have to be overlapping conceptions. And in this case, there was a less of an invitation to bring in a kind of broad discussion about what this technology might be for. Is there a situation? Is there a human circumstance to which this technology is the right response? That has not been the discussion. The discussion has been, what can we use this for? Can we find
Right.
a justified application? And
Right.
and then the question becomes, how do we find a justified application? Well, we want to evaluate safety, we want to evaluate efficacy, we want to have good scientific knowledge that, good scientific bases for judging that this, would even work and it would work well, and so on and so forth. Which is to say, building up all of those forms of capacity that bring it right up to the threshold of application as a prerequisite for asking the question, is it desirable? Is it good for people? And that produces a kind of momentum, even as it lays claim to making these kind of intermediate judgments about what's worth doing and when it has met a sort of bar of responsibility. It effectively claims those for science and makes the sort of last question essentially a kind of informed consent question. Is it, yes or no?
And it's, just to go back to your Oppenheimer example, it would be like, I just am really intellectually interested in making this guidance system. So I'm gonna work on that. And then I'm really intellectually, interested in making this detonator. So I'm not suggesting we ever put those together and actually, use a bomb, but, I'm gonna just do my little bit here to do this section of the science and sort of turn that into, to your point, it becomes a science question rather than an ethical question of what is the use case where this would ever be the right answer. Like even if the technology could perfectly work. And, frankly, that's something I still struggle with. And I liked what you said about, not having the vocabulary, because I will tell you in, the 3 days the past after this was announced and revealed what had happened, I spent most of my time just like getting into the scientific details because that felt comfortable, right? That was part of it that I could understand and also, to your point, denigrate in my own way. We could denigrate the informed consent, but also, frankly, it was just poor science in my estimation, in terms of all manner of everything that was done there. But it was because I was lacking a vocabulary, I think, to take it up a level and have the bigger the bigger sort of conversation about the ethics of what is it like. There's a thinking out there that I've heard that, oh, this is just inevitable, it's going to happen someday, right? And it'll be part of the fabric of how we exist. And I'd say, number one, I'm dubious that we'll ever have that level of, technology. I could be wrong about that. I'd like to be wrong about that, but I don't know that the technology will ever progress to the point to allow for that. But even still, I think the bigger question is, should it?
That second question is a hard question to ask. Who asks that question? How do they ask that question? One of the things I've thought and written quite a lot about is how this notion of inevitability, that the technology will advance, it will be applied, there's nothing you can do about it. All the best we can do is place limits or regulate it effectively or establish guardrails or whatever. How that is a way of not asking the should we have it question. And actually, I mean, I think that in this case in particular, but this is not a unique case. That narrative of inevitability, in effect, was a self-fulfilling prophecy. So one of the things that I've written about is this very striking thing to me. In the very early days of kind of public discussions around, CRISPR and germline genome editing, Nature Biotechnology did a kind of standardized interview of a whole bunch of major scientists and bioethicists, so on and so forth in this field. And the first question in that interview was, do you think it is inevitable that there are going to be genetically engineered children or whatever? And, a lot of people, household names in the genome editing world, said yes. And so then if it's inevitable, it becomes not a question of whether it's going to happen. It becomes a question of when it's going to happen. And then it becomes a question of who's going to do it. And then it becomes a question of, well, who's going to have the claim to fame of having done it first? Who's going to own this as a sort of innovation? And, I think one of the things to appreciate in the He Jiankui case, and this is not a defense by any means, because I think what he did was abhorrent, and have said so, including to him many times. But it's an effort to understand where it came from. He, a young, aspiring scientist from a country that is a sort of aspiring scientific superpower. I mean, is trying to achieve a kind of level of parity with the US and Europe, say, investing very heavily in it, including investing in its young and up and coming scientists, took that inevitability story seriously and saw that there is a kind of geopolitics to priority and prestige in science, and observed that in 2015, when one of the early published experiments involving genetic modification of embryos, these were triploid embryos left over from IVF, so they were non-viable embryos. This was not for pregnancy. It was a sort of proof of principle experiment that took place in China, that created a kind of international stir. And yet, it's only about 18 months later that an American-based researcher at Oregon Health and Science University, Shukrat Matalpov, undertook an experiment in which he created a large number of viable embryos in order to undertake essentially the same project, correcting a disease-causing gene. It just felt like a double standard to He, right? I mean, this is the American gets celebrated, the Chinese guy gets pilloried, and looked to precedents in the history of science. I mean, he read biographies. I can cite all kinds of things he developed around this, conversations he had with people about how controversial science proceeds and unfolds. And one of the kind of key points of reference was Robert Edwards. Robert Edwards and Patrick Steptoe, who produced the first baby through IVF, Louise Brown, in 1978. And Edwards later won the Nobel Prize for that in 2011, I think. And Steptoe not, because he was already dead. But he'll look to that, as many people look to such stories, to see that here is controversial science, that somebody goes out on a limb and they just go for it. In this case, these guys made a baby. They didn't actually know whether it was going to be a safe thing for that child or not. The sort of regulators, the first thing they had on their minds, they've told me, the interviews I've done around this in 1978, was thalidomide, right? Are we going to have another disaster visited upon the health of children because of an experimental intervention that hasn't been vetted properly? But it was a sort of like, just go for it. And it was an enormous reaction. It was seen as highly controversial, and then so they came to be accepted and came to be widespread. And fast forward a few decades, and wins the Nobel Prize. He imagined the same sort of dynamic applying to him, and why shouldn't he? Right? I mean, the notion that you should move quickly and break things, that risk-taking science is where it's at. That the pioneers are the people who have an appetite for can handle controversy, and furthermore that science races ahead and should race ahead, and society lags behind. And so if you're going to go by society's intuitions about what's right and acceptable, you're never going to get anything done. You have to just go for it, and then people will be aghast for a minute, and then they'll think about it, and then they'll get used to it, and then they'll accept it, and then they'll be grateful for it, and then they'll later on celebrate you as a pioneer. I mean, has been posting things on social media recently that suggest that he still believes himself to be, in the running for pioneer rather than rogue. He was, after all, included in Time Magazine's 100 most influential people of 2018, I guess, and as a pioneer. There's a sense in which the story is still getting written. I don't think he's a pioneer, but these are the ways of thinking about innovation that in a lot of respects drive innovation. Look at AI, you see these things all over the place. And it's these ways of thinking about responsibility and indeed about ethics, right? That our ethics is old. It's calibrated to what came before. Ethics needs to catch up with science. And so science needs to push ahead. In order for ethics to catch up with it, science has to have the confidence to push into territories so that, the ethics can catch up. I mean, these are narratives that people tell them, that stories people tell themselves, and that they act upon. And I think in this case, I'm absolutely convinced that in this case, this happened because Poe was telling himself that story, but many other people were also telling him and telling themselves and telling a wider community that story. It's a
Yeah.
self-fulfilling prophecy.
I don't disagree that that was a contributing factor to sort of the why, and particular maybe the why was the one who did this first. It seems at odds from, and again, these are the kind of best practices, right? That I worry fall into that category of, we have a system of compliance that we sort of aspire to as we develop novel therapies, right? And for me, the best practice is always come back to what's the problem you're trying to solve, right? And I would posit, ostensibly, the problem He was trying to solve for the two embryos was their risk of being infected by HIV in the future. They weren't infected in that moment. It was a possibility that they could be infected in the future. And so knock out that CCR5 gene in order to prevent that from occurring. However, in the case of one of the embryos, the edit that occurred was an edit that is not clear that it will have that intended effect in knocking out CCR5's function. And in the other embryo, it was a mosaic. So there's still going to be some wild type cells that could be infected by HIV for that one of the twins. And so I guess I'm struggling with, and maybe this is something we all need to struggle with in gene and cell therapy. Do we need to hold ourselves to a higher account on the question of what is it we're trying to solve? And why is this the only way to solve it? And are the risks worth the benefit? Like, is that the thread that was missing, or part of the thread? Maybe there are more threads, but is that part of the thread that was missing? Even if that is one of the threads, I mean, for me, I am still unpersuaded that there is a valuable use case for germline editing at all. I can't think of a single use case or a single example where germline editing is required to solve something that's unsolvable by another means, for instance, by pre-implantation genetic diagnosis alone. So how do we dissociate sort of use and benefit and risk as we interrogate what went wrong with He?
Yeah, I think we need to hold ourselves to a higher standard in this emerging field. How and what that standard is, that I think needs to be a matter for ongoing and much more expansive deliberation than has happened so far. I think, for reasons that I'll illustrate and just dissect, that it can't be left to even a very well-meaning research community to sort of take sole responsibility for these questions. For what it's worth, I'm a co-leader of an enterprise. We call ourselves the Global Observatory on Genome Editing, that is precisely about this problem, the effort to expand deliberation and even to build forms of deliberative capacity that ask the broader questions that are kind of going unasked in the routines of scientific governance. So if people are interested in that and want to plug into that, I would encourage you to do so. But let me use the He case as an illustration. So one of the critiques, even that emerged in the very session in which he was speaking at the summit, was that this was an intervention that was, quote, medically unnecessary. I think the most articulate critic of him, at least as I recall in my jet-lagged fog, was David Liu, who stood up and very compellingly said, this was medically unnecessary. You should not have done this. This was medically unnecessary. Why did these children didn't need this? You have done damage because you haven't done good. It was medically unnecessary. And that's right, except that it claims medical necessity as a kind of domain of biomedical judgment. And I think we have to appreciate the extent to which judgments of what is medically necessary and unnecessary are, socially and culturally situated and in important respects contingent. So the situation, you're right, this was a attempt to inactivate a gene, a T cell receptor gene associated with HIV infection. Why do that? Why do that? Especially given the fact that, okay, so one of the kind of conditions of inclusion in He's clinical trial was that the father, the male partner, was HIV positive, but was, on antiretroviral treatment and, with very low viral, et cetera. And in a family situation like that, there is basically no elevated risk of a child contracting HIV than a child who doesn't have an infected parent, than anybody else out there in the world, right? So what was the point? Well, it's worth appreciating that in China, HIV carries with it not just the biomedical implications, but a profound social stigma. Like, if you are discovered to be HIV positive, your life is essentially over. You better move away and change your name and start over, basically. And I'm not exaggerating that, right? And so, I mean, one of the things He did in the course of his project was to visit a village in which there had been, because of bad blood collection practices, there had been widespread HIV infection. And the children from this village, in spite of the fact that, since then, basically the people are living pretty well with HIV and the kids aren't necessarily affected by it in any particular way. These kids were excluded from the town school and then from the school, and they had to have their own school because they're sort of social pariahs. And He was actually very affected by this. And there's a sense in which what this was about for the people participating in the trial was not just about the sort of biomedical dimension of HIV infection. It was about immunization of their children against the risk of infection, where what was included in the package of the risk of infection was also social association, was stigma, the heritable transmission of stigma. And I'm not suggesting that they thought about that as two different things. Those things are inextricably bound up together, but they are culturally situated, right? So HIV has a particular meaning in that environment that is different than say in the United States. But one can look at many different things that are genetic, right? That can be pathologized and that are socially situated and have a cultural meaning where the kind of culturally independent biological dimensions of it are not where it's at. Well, because in a sense, you can't separate them from the culturally situated dimensions of them. And so if you think of this as medically unnecessary, I mean, if the disease of HIV is a life-destroying disease, even if the virus itself isn't biologically destroying your life, well, medically unnecessary, maybe not. I mean, that's sort of in the judgment of the affected patient, you might say. And if you open up your imagination to think of all the different kinds of interventions that could be made that would relieve people of physical, biological traits, conditions, etc., that they see, whether rightly or wrongly, as detrimental to their lives, even in a merely social sense, boy, there's a lot of quote unquote diseases out there that might not get classified as diseases in a conventional, biomedical pathology textbook, right? And that it's that I think we need to be aware of in the domain, certainly the domain of heritable genome editing, but actually also in the domain of somatic genome editing, because the repertoire, the pharmacopoeia is going to expand to include a lot of things that are not diseases that are a death sentence within a few short years or something like that. So I think you can see how a genetic fix to that social problem would be very, very attractive to an individual. And you can see how there could be a market for that kind of genetic fix. But an environment in which genetic fixes to social problems become, kind of technological possibilities, let alone desiderata, that is an environment that we should be very, very wary of. And asking questions about informed consent or asking questions about whether it's medically necessary, those are insufficient to contend with the sorts of inhumane orientations to human life that these sorts of technologies open the door to.
Well, and you mentioned informed consent again, and it takes on an interesting. So whether or not the informed consent was sufficient for the parents is one question that perhaps people can debate. But I think the other challenge, right, with germline editing is that the individual undergoing the edit is not in a position to have informed consent. Help me understand how that should change our thinking about which use cases are even, like, what is the threshold for an appropriate use case? Is there any threshold? Because that individual is not in a position to say, okay, go for it.
So this argument has come up for a long time around questions of enhancement, for example, and people argue, well, parents make all kinds of decisions for their children. They make their children take piano lessons and go to tutoring and wear eyeglasses and et cetera, all these sort of things for the betterment of the child, even if the child not only doesn't consent, but vigorously objects. I hate piano. I don't want to go. And so, the sort of authority of the parent to make those judgments is, seen as well established and not different in kind in the case of genetic interventions necessarily versus in other sorts of efforts to shape your child, whether it's making medical judgments, lowest 5% of height, take, growth hormone or whatever. I mean, these sorts of judgments. I think that, yes, there is something to worry about there for sure, that you are making a child a future person. You're making interventions into a future person that will be lifelong according to your vision of what is good for them. And so without question, there is a kind of heightened responsibility associated with rendering those judgments. But I would want to ask a further question, and that is the opening the door to these kinds of interventions in which the future health and life of a person is subject to intervention, even for the best possible intentions. I mean, is that perverting the parent-child relationship, or at least potentially perverting the parent-child relationships in ways that it shouldn't be, expanding the forms of the capacities for intervention beyond the limits of, I mean, maybe those limits are good limits. I mean, I'm not giving an answer to this. I'm saying this is a question that we need to ask. And furthermore, the notion that this is a matter of individual judgment, which is how we tend to approach these things. It's between you and your doctor. It's a individual choice. I mean, it basically treats it as a matter of consumer choice, right? Do you avail yourself? You don't have to use the technology. It's your choice. So it frames it as a matter of individual choice, when actually the significance of these things is not limited to an individual. Certainly, as you're pointing out, not the individual making the purchase, so to speak, which is to say the would-be parent, but also the affected child, but also the environment that child is part of, how that child understands themselves in relation to that environment, how that wider community understands the child, how the conditions that are intervened in are understood, how parental responsibility is understood. So it's parent to child, it's medicine to patient, but it's state to society as well, and sort of society to its members. Because, I mean, if it becomes reasonable to think your parents are bad parents because, you get breast cancer in your 40s because you have a genetic predisposition to elevated risk, I mean, that's actually a transformation of a sort of concept of parental responsibility, and the obligations and imperatives associated with being a good parent are transformed. It's not just a matter of, offering a choice to people. It's a matter of creating obligations that people may not want the opportunity to act upon those, but once they have the opportunity to act on, responsibility is forced upon them and they must act upon them. And how will they be judged? They have to imagine the future judgment of their child, of them, or of the society around them, or whatever. I mean, these are transformative interventions into the most fundamental human relationships, and we should approach them with great care, because, it's not as simple as making a quote unquote informed choice. These are judgments that are manifest over lifetimes, right?
Yeah.
And again, these are acutely visible in the domain of heritable genome editing, but they are not absent in the domain of somatic interventions. they may not be present in quite the same way yet, but they're potentially emergent, and they should be, we should anticipate them and wrestle with them in advance, not
Proactively, not
reactively.
reactively.
Because if we let it all develop and we use these sort of background commitments, these insufficiently developed kind of normalized common sense ways of thinking about things, like, well, make the technologies and then let people choose whether they want to use them, we have produced those conditions of inevitability that will
Right.
cause us later to say, well, there's nothing we can do about it. The technology's here. It's inevitable.
So with that, I usually close these podcasts by letting people wave a magic wand and fix one thing for cell and gene therapy development. But I'm going to let you use this magic wand for whatever you want, be it on the state level, the community level, the population level. If you could fix something, if you could start a dialogue, what would that look like? What shape would it take?
The magic wand I would wave would push aside the sorts of constraints we impose upon ourselves and the excuses we often make to not contend with these hard questions that feel unresolvable. We say no one is trying to do that, so there's no point in talking about it, right? Our company isn't in that business, so we have nothing to say about it. Well, if you're producing knowledge that may inform it, if you're producing a product with a price tag that may encourage somebody else to produce something else that does the same thing cheaper, you're engaged in it, right? And so I would want to wave the wand and free everybody from the fear of the unknown that comes with asking expansive questions about what is virtuous and what is maybe less virtuous, what is thoughtful and what is thoughtless in the projects that are being undertaken in this domain of science and technology in the name of improving people's lives. We need to have those conversations. Those conversations need to be inclusive. They need to be exploratory. They need to be experimental. They may be, and they likely will be, inconclusive, but we will make progress by having them. Certainly much more progress than we will make by not having them. And our mode is to treat things in a circumscribed way, ask questions about this experiment, this product, this thing that's happening now, to delimit it in order to keep the ethical questions simple. But actually, the complex questions are there. You're answering them whether you acknowledge it and recognize it or not. And the omissions are just as consequential as the commissions and explicit judgments. And we should see that and own it. And then throw the doors open to the messy complexity of deliberation about what these extraordinary powers for good should be put to. What is the good? Let us collectively imagine and articulate what is the good to which these technologies should be applied, and what are the territories? What are the limits that should be placed on them, whether out of recognized actual harm or simply out of prudence or whatever. Those are hard conversations to have. They are also conversations that may, for some people with their existing investments, their professional aspirations, their intellectual property or whatever, may find unwelcome. And so I think those are barriers to having those conversations, but they should be overcome because, this is about the human future. And the human future belongs to all of us, and it should be a conversation that is inclusive, not one whose answers are served up in the form of ready to deploy technologies that people basically have to accept.
Absolutely. I fully endorse that. Ask the big questions and ask them often and ask them of everyone and ourselves. Ben Hurlbut, thank you so much for coming on the issue. I expect we may have you back again to talk about other topics, since this is such a important thread that weaves through everything that we do in gene and cell therapy development. Thank you so much, Ben.
No, thanks very much for having me.